Welcome to the Trent England Show. It's Thursday. We are sliding toward the end of the week. And what is this? The first week without the legislature being in town. So we get to talk about some other things, including Blue State Blues. I had a follow-up story. I've got to share this with you because we talked about this the other day. Does politics matter? Does policy matter? It does. Obviously, it does. And it does in a lot of ways that are hard to see as government incrementally grows and puts more pressure and puts more burdens on people. But sometimes they take a big step, and that is what they just did in California with a mandate for almost all new construction in the Golden State. Going to take a lot more gold to build houses in the Golden State because almost all new construction is going to have solar panels starting in 2020. This is a new mandate there that the legislature has adopted in California. I mean, look, this is not complicated. I guess this is my point, right? These things aren't really that complicated. Does this make housing more expensive? Yes, it does. Does this hurt people in Beverly Hills? No, it does not. Does it hurt current homeowners very much? No, it does not. Does it hurt young people? Does it hurt middle-income people who want to buy a house, right? Yes, it does. I mean, it's so easy to understand who takes it in the shorts from these stupid policies in blue states. Sometimes they're little incremental policies, right? This is really the point, right? Everybody can look at this and say, this is bad public policy. It's making things more expensive. It's manipulating people. It's hurting poor people, right? Everybody can look at this and understand that. I mean, apparently, other than California legislators, but lots of little things happen this way. And I tell you, I see people up at the legislature say, what difference does it make? What difference does it make if we don't let people see a nurse practitioner, when they have a stomach ache? We're going to get to stomach aches in just a minute here. I've got a story on that too. What difference does it make if we let people sell eyeglasses wherever they want to versus keeping it really restricted to protect the status quo and to protect people's ability to overcharge customers for eyeglasses, right? I mean, a lot of people, honestly, it's not a big deal. It's not that big of a deal. Look, stories like this, looking at it maybe in other states, helps us here in Oklahoma understand this stuff matters, and it actually hurts people. That's why I work on public policy. It's probably why you're here watching too, right? Because ultimately I care about having a society where people can actually compete on a fair and even playing field, right? And where people can start out poor and get ahead. And frankly, I will say this. Some of the folks who don't care, frankly, are people who they've got theirs. They've got enough. And so it's not a big deal. I don't care if they tax those people over there. I don't care if they, raise taxes or increase regulations here or there because it doesn't affect me. I've got mine. I've got enough. And, as I said about California solar panels, right? It doesn't affect people in Beverly Hills. It doesn't affect even people who just own a home already, right? Once you make it to a certain point, you can survive a lot of this. But you want to know the secret? You want to know the secret of American success? And the dangerous ignorance of the elites, it's this, right? A lot of what has allowed America to have limited government and to have a lot less fascination with fixation on classes and economic classes and less class warfare is that most of the poor in America, and I'm going to talk about one of these people specifically in just a minute, most people who started out poor in America in the 19th century, in the 20th century, they believed, and rightly so, the data suggests rightly so, that they believed that they or their children or their children's children had a pretty good shot of making it in their chosen field, of making it economically, of going from people who showed up with almost nothing on our shores and wind up being successful entrepreneurs, sometimes on a small scale, sometimes on a medium scale, sometimes on a huge scale, right? We have these stories as Americans, and when the elites stop caring about or even start interfering with people's ability to believe, to hope, then they take away any reason for people who aren't among the elites to not engage in class warfare, right? If I'm poor and I believe that my children have a chance at being rich, do I want to stick it to the rich? Do I want to soak the rich? Do I want to tear down the rich? Do I want to destroy people's ability to be in business? No, I do not. But once the elites create a system that stagnates that prevents it prevents people from having that kind of hope, well, then they create a very different atmosphere, and I think we see some of this in America. I know we see some of this in America even today. Okay, story in the Oklahoman. Story number 2 here on the Trent England Show. Story in the Oklahoman on Sunday. Headline, schools plagued by low funding as student needs increase. We've talked a lot about education on the Trent England Show, but I want to raise this from a different angle because this is one of these stories that, the number of kids on free lunch has gone up, and now kids need free breakfast, and now kids need free dinner, and now we have to send food home with kids, and the kids on IEPs has gone up. And look, I'm going to be super politically incorrect. No, I don't apologize. No, I don't apologize. I'm going to be super politically incorrect here for just a minute because I'm going to tell the truth about kids and schools, and some people are going to be very upset, possibly even Ben Felder, who wrote this story. But he was a great writer, by the way. Sometimes he needs help with the facts, and we're going to do that for him right now. I mean, look, I already have pointed out on the program before, when they talk about increasing students on free lunch, I pointed out that a lot of what has happened is that the standard for who gets free and reduced lunch in schools has been weakened, and more and more kids have been included, not because more kids are poor. Actually, more kids are not poor, right? It's actually because we've changed the standards for who gets access to the programs. Now, look, you can argue whether that's good or bad. We can argue whether that's good or bad. That fact is not dispositive to anything except when somebody comes along and says, oh, look, we've got all these students and we have to feed them in our schools. I mean, if the schools have changed their policies and they feed everybody, as some schools do, right, well, that tells us nothing at all about what's actually going on in that school and in those families. Okay, but that's just a starting point here, right? I want us to think back in American history, how many kids, and you got to follow me here, you'll think I'm being more insensitive than I am. I'm being insensitive, but not as much as you might think at the beginning. How many kids were on individualized education plans 100 years ago, 50 years ago? 0. The answer is 0. How many kids were in special ed classes in 1850 in the United States? The answer was 0, right? Okay, now here's my point. Were there kids who needed special ed in 1850, in 1900, right? Were there kids who would have qualified for an IEP or free lunch in 1930? The answer to all those questions is yes, but those programs didn't exist. And again, I'm kind of drawing this point out a little bit more when people come along and say, oh my word, our schools today, and we get this from those who make excuses for the current state of our schools, which is really what Ben Felder's article here in the Oklahoman is all about, saying, yeah, our schools can't teach a lot of kids to read, but you can't blame the schools. You've got to blame the legislature, you blame the families. Don't you blame the schools. Don't you point to anything going on in those schools and say those schools could do it better, because that's not fair to those schools, because our society is falling apart around us, right? That's the point that they're trying to make. And you know who I always think of? And look, I understand this is anecdotal. I'm gonna broaden this point out. I always think of Abraham Lincoln, right? I mean, Abraham Lincoln would have been taken away from his father and put into foster care if he was around today, right? If you know the story of Abraham Lincoln's childhood. At multiple times he would have been pulled from his home and put in foster care. He would have qualified for free lunch all the way through school, right? I mean, this is a guy who had serious economic and family problems growing up, right? And he wasn't alone. I mean, look, here's the point. The point is, our schools in America, I mean, if you believe that everything was just fine and every kid showed up ready to learn and every kid had a supportive family 50 years ago, you're watching too much Leave It to Beaver. Right? Turn off the Nickelodeon. What is it? Is it Nick at Night? Is that what they have? It probably doesn't even exist anymore. I don't know. Right? I mean, that is just not the reality. And these stories that we get fed to us, and it's even worse. It's even worse. I'm gonna get to the really politically incorrect stuff in just a minute. But these stories we get fed to us from the media, making excuses for schools that can't teach kids to learn. I mean, it is. If our schools can't teach kids to learn, we need to do something, don't we, right? Instead of just sitting around whining like Ben Felder in this article, well, you know, our schools, they can't do the job, but it's not their fault, right? Well, we better figure something out then, right? And the obvious answer to this question, right, is if, to the extent that Ben Felder is right, to the extent that any of these apologists are right, the answer is school choice. I'm sorry, I'm sorry I have to say that. I know that a lot of people are, oh, that's just a political agenda. No, look, if what's going on in American society, and some of this is true, and in certain ways it's true, and in other ways it's not true, in many ways it's overstated, but look, society changes all the time, families change, the needs of kids change to some degree, not as much as people claim. But look, to the extent that we're becoming more diverse, we ought to have more diverse options in education, right? This is common sense. This is not complicated. If our schools are actually facing more and more various kinds of challenges, then shouldn't we have more and more various kinds of schools? Doesn't that just make sense? I mean, to whom does that not make sense, right? Well, to the people who work in the status quo. I understand that. To the people who work in the status quo right now, right, who put their own needs in front of others, and there are many people who don't, right? There are many teachers, principals, probably even some superintendents somewhere who support school choice, who support, who don't want to stand in the schoolhouse door and lock kids into a situation that doesn't work for them, right? But we also understand why people who are self-interested want to protect what they have. And again, we're back to the elites that we were talking about in California with solar panels, right? It's the same dynamic. I've got mine, I'm going to keep what's mine, and I don't care who gets hurt. And who gets hurt is always people at the bottom of the ladder trying to climb up. But here's the really politically incorrect stuff. We have created so many, and I was thinking about this reading this article, we have created so many categories, so many labels, so many programs, so many statuses, so many little boxes to check next to a kid. There's a great article that the BBC, I follow the BBC because it's a good way to kind of get a sampling of what people are thinking over there across the pond. Sometimes it just reminds us why we fought a war. But this is actually a really good article from the BBC. I'm going to put this link up. You'll be really interested in this, I think. I thought this was fascinating. It was a reporter, a BBC reporter who had lived in Italy for a number of years, and the reporter's writing about Italians and how Italians experience maladies, sicknesses, that this reporter had never heard of before and couldn't even figure out how to translate, and how Italians had this really in-depth, literally, understanding of human anatomy, and so they would say things like, my spleen hurts, my intestine hurts. They would have these different conditions, being hit by the air, and all these things, and the reporter came to understand that it seemed like a lot of these illnesses other people just weren't susceptible to because they didn't know what they were. Which is not, now look, I have to say, this is not the same. I used to be kind of a jerk, and I would tell people in my immediate family when I was a child that everything was just psychosomatic, that everything was just in people's minds. And that's not fair, right? Because if you believe you're sick, you're sick. I mean, actually, you're sick, right? If you really believe that you're sick, you're sick. You might not be physically sick, although we certainly can, if we believe we're sick, make ourselves physically sick, but you're sick whether you like it or not, sort of, right? And this is the point. I mean, yes, do we see more conditions in schools today? Do kids have more quote-unquote problems today than they used to have? Well, yeah, but a lot of this relates to the fact that we have more names and labels and categories to put kids in today, in order to convince them and convince their parents and convince the school system and convince the government programs that give out additional money based on these classifications that we have more and more kids who have more and more of these problems. Some of them major, some of them minor, many of them real to a certain extent. Right? But they also create excuses for adults, and anybody who's, I mean, look, I've worked in youth programs in churches for a long time, and anybody who's worked in youth programs is familiar with the scenario where, well, that kid has this problem, and so you can't hold that kid to the same level of expectations for all other kids. And I always think, because I study a lot of history, well, 50 years ago, we wouldn't know that kid had that problem, and I would hold that kid to the same expectations as all the other kids, and that kid would probably rise to the occasion, and that kid wouldn't be sick because he wouldn't believe he was sick, and I wouldn't be treating him like he was sick, and his parents wouldn't be telling him all the time that he's sick, and he wouldn't be raised to be a sick human being, right? And we wouldn't. Now that's the really politically incorrect piece that I know is going to make some people uncomfortable. But look, that is a part of what's going on in our schools, and part of the point is, I mean, look, if you know, people can raise their kids however they want to, and I don't believe the government should tell you how to do that. However, if we're going to design government programs and design government-run education to pay schools to identify kids as having problems, well, then I expect the reporters who turn around and write stories about schools finding out that more and more kids have problems to at least point out where the money goes. Can we at least follow the money? Isn't that one of the basic rules of journalism here? Can we at least acknowledge? I mean, even the what's the story that I found on the solar panels in California? I mean, even that story here from Bloomberg points out that a part of what's going on is that, look, who wins? Solar panel companies win, right? There's always a winner. Follow the money. Who do you think bankrolled the politicians who passed the mandate in California? I bet it wasn't just your average homeowner. I bet it was people who own companies that make solar panels and install solar panels and loan money to seniors to put solar panels on their houses based on false promises that it's going to, be a big money maker, right? If you followed this area of the news, you've seen those stories before out of California, Arizona, Nevada. Some states have actually passed enhanced consumer protection laws to protect people from some of these solar panel companies. Did you know that? Look, if we want to address the problems in our schools, we have to be real about what those problems are. And if we find that our current schools can't address current problems, or may even be contributing to those problems, it's time to do something else. You know, one of the reasons why some charter schools have been found to have fewer students with, who are categorized as learning disabled? There was a study on this that found that one of the reasons that's true is that many students who had individualized education plans, IEPs, this is something that students get when they're identified as having some kind of a disability, right? Under federal law, they get an IEP, an individualized education plan, which basically guarantees their right to sue their school and go into a multi-year court process. The parents can go into a multi-year court process if they feel like the school isn't being responsive to their needs, right? And this is what defenders of the status quo say is good enough. Well, as long as we give you a right to hire an attorney and pay tens of thousands of dollars and wait years to try to force your school to take care of your kid, like that should be good enough. Don't expect us to let you put your kid in a program that actually works better, right? We want to create jobs for lawyers, right? That seems to be what government does. What government does best, is that right? Create jobs for lawyers. But look, if our schools can't do it, we need to open those doors, and the study on charter schools found that many students who had an IEP, who had been identified as having some kind of a learning disability, when they arrived at the charter school and they spent a year or two at the charter school, all of a sudden the folks at the charter school said, this student doesn't have a disability, the student was just behind. This student doesn't have a disability, this student doesn't need an IEP, this student just needed to be held to high expectations and provided with a better learning environment, maybe saved from a situation where the student was suffering bullying. And actually, one of the reasons why charter schools have fewer students who are identified as learning disabled is that charter schools throw that label around less often, partly because they just operate differently and partly because they don't make money identifying kids that way. So look, that's all I've got for today. I hope that's interesting. I'm going to share the link to this story, the BBC story. I thought it was fascinating, very, gets you thinking about health and how we think about ourselves and our kids. I'm Trent England. Thanks for watching. Remember, you can find the podcast on iTunes. We're on SoundCloud. We're on Stitcher. We're now on Google Play. So you can go to your Google Play music store, type in the Trent England Show, and if you've got an Android phone, we've been on iTunes for a long time for you Apple folks out there, but now Android people like me can go and go to the Play Store and actually subscribe to the Trent England Show podcast that way. Of course, we're on YouTube. We're on Facebook. Like us on Facebook. Follow us. What do? You subscribe on YouTube. And send me your thoughts, your feedback, anything you want to hear about on the show. We are always looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much for watching.